Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Alligator Pit. And I just want to thank you for tuning in. So in this evening's video, we will talk about the history of so-called Black American criminal-minded Islamic extremists. We're going to talk about the history of so-called Black American criminal-minded Islamic extremists. All right. So most of us know when we look on the modern day news, CNN, Fox News, etc., since the beginning of the global war on terrorism, which actually stems back decades, a lot of us are very familiar with the propaganda that's put out about so-called Islamic terrorism. All right. So, whether you are a Caucasian United States citizen or a melanated American, all of us have somewhat of a familiarity with the United States of America being a little bit cautious of the religion of Islam, the culture of Islam, and people that live in Islamic nations coming to the Americas. They're a little bit cautious of them. All right. There is a certain danger that the United States or Western Christian nations associate Islam with. All right. So we're going to look a little bit into that history and get an understanding to why that is. All right. And also we're going to do it through, the historical perspective of the so-called Black American. All right. So when the so-called Black American man chooses to rehabilitate himself, a lot of the times we see brothers from the streets or brothers that may be coming from more of a rough and rugged background. They would choose the route of Islam. And it's for a variety of reasons. One of the main reasons is that Christianity, as far as the so-called Black American man is concerned, he hadn't been taught properly about, the ancient Judaic Shemitic culture of the Old Testament. So he thinks that, the narrative of so-called Jesus Christ being a Caucasian, a lot of brothers don't want to rehabilitate themselves and then associate with that, because a lot of the rehabilitation process that brothers have to go through is because of the systematic oppression and deprivation, really, that they've suffered under colonialism here in the Americas. So when I say colonialism, I mean that, when the Europeans came and they arrived on the Eastern Seaboard, going all the way back to the Spanish Crusaders, indigenous melanated American men have been, battling really to keep their integrity, their dignity for quite a while. So, part of that oppression and that poverty, it's led to a lot of the stuff you see going on in the so-called Black community today. So when you see brothers in the streets and they want to get themselves right, this is just some of the background of what led them to Islam. They're trying to rehabilitate themselves from the systematic oppression, really, that our people have been in this country. Now, is systematic oppression a good enough reason for you to become criminal minded and to become maybe a so-called terrorist? No. A lot of the terrorism that we're doing, a lot of it is domestic. Some of the so-called gangs in the Black community, they're performing terrorism on their own community and their own nation of people. So we're going to look into this history, man, and hopefully you can get some understanding about it and some enlightenment. All right. So the first thing I want to do is I want to put out a prelude that not all so-called Black American Muslims have the potential to be a terrorist or be a threat or a danger to anyone. OK, so just because someone practices Islam, just because someone practices Christianity, just because someone practices Judaism doesn't mean that they are an extremist. All right. So we don't want to let a certain faction within these religions destroy the name and the face card for everybody. OK, so, we got bad apples in every group, in every religious group, any kind of group you can think of when human beings are coming together, any kind of society. You're going to have people in it for the right reason and you're going to have people in it for the wrong reason. OK, so the first thing we want to do is separate the wheat from the tares. All right. Now, when we think about Islam, you think about the term a Muslim or a Muslim. OK, a lot of the times you will hear me use the word Muslim, Moslem, versus the word Muslim, Muslim. All right. And the only reason I like to use the word Muslim is just because it has more of an ancient flair and energy to it. All right. As it pertains to original people. So the first question is what is a true Muslim? Because in order to understand the history of so-called Black American men and some of the Islamic extremism that the brothers have participated in, you do have to understand what Islam is. So The first part of this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the origins of the religion of Islam. Why did Islam show up on the scene? What is actually a Muslim? And then we'll, fast forward into some things that you all may be familiar with, all right, and give some examples. But the first thing that we want to answer is, what is a true Muslim, all right? For one, being a Muslim actually is an action or it's a behavior, all right? So being a Muslim is an action or behavior. So think about in school, you had a noun, an adjective, or a verb. And think about how a verb is an action, is something that you do. So like a verb would be to run, to talk, to jump, to cry. These are all physical things that the human being can actually do. And it can be expressed or portrayed through our behavior, okay? So when you say that someone is a Muslim, what you're saying is that this is a person who submits their will to the will of the Almighty Creator or the Almighty Power, okay? So being a Muslim is an action verb. It's something you do. It's when you submit your own will to the will of the Almighty Creator, all right? Or what some of us like to call God, all right? And all religions have a particular path where they submit their will to the will of the Almighty, or the will or the objective of the overall life purpose itself, okay? So when we think about who were some of the original Muslims, all right? The original Muslims in the Old Testament or the Torah or the Bible were/are all the Shemitic Israelite prophets, priests, and men of wisdom who submitted their will to the will of the Almighty Power, instead of submitting to their own ego, desires, personal goals, ambitions, or their own self-interest or their own selfishness. So let's think about, for example, the prophet Jesus, how, he didn't want that burden that he had to try to, reform the Israelite religion. But nevertheless, he stood tall and he did it. Or let's think about how Jonah, when Jonah was sent to, the nation of Nineveh, the civilization of Nineveh, and the people were very, very reprobate and wicked. And he was sent there to do, a lot of work to try to get the people on the right road. But he really didn't want to do it. And he tried to avoid that. But eventually, through his own trials and tribulations, he made that decision to submit his will to the Almighty. Or think about how with the story with Abraham, when Abraham was, differentiating between the new Israelite religion and the ancient pagan religion. And when he was led to think that he was going to have to sacrifice his son, but when he stopped, or in other words, the angel or God led him to stop. But it was basically testing his obedience. All right. So he submitted his will. Let's bring it to something very, very simplistic. Let's say you have a person who, may be born, but let's say they're not that tall, right? Let's say they were born and they were only 5'5". And let's say that they were in love with the sport of basketball. And they had ambitions to want to be an NBA player, right? But let's say that they had a natural gift at computer technology, using their hands, engineering. Let's say that they were skilled in the area of computer engineering and it was very natural to them. So they have an individual desire to want to play in the NBA. If they were to continue to move forward with that, even though the will of the Creator may be for them to be a computer engineer, because a lot of the natural talents and skill sets that you have, that's what the Almighty Power has given you as a seed to grow, so you can provide the earth or the ecosystem, the fruit from that tree that you do. So this person that was born 5'5" and that's very good at computer engineering, they're supposed to become the master of computer engineering and provide that service to the earth environment itself. And they'll bless the earth with that skill set, and in return, the earth will bless them. They weren't given the full skill set and the full package to be an NBA player, because part of that is you have to be born tall. So if you were born 5'5", maybe it may not be the will of the Almighty for you to be in professional sports. It may be something else that the will of the Almighty wants you to do. So if you submit to that and say, you know what, I want to play basketball, but it looks like my life path is designed to be a computer engineer. I'm going to put my ego to the side and I'm going to go down the path of becoming a computer engineer. That person would be a Muslim. They are submitting to the will of the Almighty Creator. So think about when I said, when you submit to that Almighty Power versus your own ego, your own desires, your own personal goals and ambition, luxury, materialism, that is actually what a Muslim is, okay? So it's an action verb. It's something that you can do. Your religion, ethnicity, or nationality does not make you a Muslim. Following religious dogmas, rituals, and ceremonies does not make you a Muslim. Following the will of the Almighty Power makes you a Muslim. And the deen is a way of life. It's a lifestyle choice and decision, okay? So you have a lot of people in, the so-called Black Christian church, and you see it also in the Judaic and the Islamic communities of the world. But you have a lot of these religious ceremonies and practices. And, the person that can pray the best, or the person that knows how to perform wudu the best, now all of a sudden they're seen as a true Muslim, but maybe their character and their attitude is poor. Maybe they're very, very greedy. Maybe they don't know how to share with people. Maybe they're hypocritical. So on the outward external, they look like they're doing the right thing, but internally they're not. And just like the Most High told the prophet Samuel that he does not see what man sees. He sees something different. So yeah, you may be in the so-called Black church and you go to Bible study every Wednesday, you go to church every Sunday, but you could be a hypocrite. Okay. So the first thing is understanding what a true Muslim is and what is the true path of Islam. Islam is not a separate religion. Okay. Islam is the same religion of Adam, the same religion of Abraham, the same religion of Shem, the same religion of Isaac, the same religion of Jacob, all the way down to the prophet Jesus. Okay. So the prophet Muhammad did not create the quote unquote religion of Islam. The religion of Islam goes back to the original man and woman. Okay. The next thing we want to talk about is some of the origins of the religion of Islam. So why did the religion of Islam show up on the scene? Where did it come from? What was the intention and the objective of it? All right. And we're going to just go through some very, very brief and basic to, get an understanding, because most of the main differences between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism is the understanding of the prophet Jesus and his story, and the Christians implementing the Holy Trinity, whereas the Muslims of the Israelite kingdom and the Muslims of the Ishmaelite world, they didn't create an idol out of God. So they didn't have a Holy Trinity. So that's mainly the difference. The understanding of the prophet Jesus' history and the anthropomorphic Trinity that the Christians associated with the Almighty or God. Okay. So the first thing to understand, regarding the history, the Shemitic Israelite rabbis and authority who worked with Rome to attack the prophet Jesus. So I'm talking about now in the New Testament, where you had the high priest Caiaphas, and the high priest Caiaphas was very, very, disturbed by the prophet Jesus showing up on the scene, because Jesus was trying to reform the religion. Okay. So understand that during the time of Caiaphas, when the prophet Jesus was attacked, the Romans and those dirty Jewish rabbis were working together to do this. So you had Judaism plus the Roman/Mithraic idol worship coming together. And this is where you get Roman Catholic Christianity from. Okay. Roman Catholic Christianity. So remember, during Rome, they had various idols that they worshiped. All right. And one of the main idols that they dealt with was Mithra, or the Mithraic religion. All right. And that's where you get the whole attributes of the sun god being given to so-called Jesus Christ. OK, so when you think about him being born on December 25th, when you think about him, raising during the spring equinox, a lot of those attributes that they later on applied to so-called Jesus Christ during the Nicene Council in the 300s AD, these were attributes taken from the pagan gods of old, taken from Baal, taken from Moloch, Osiris, Horus, etc. And they were later on applied to so-called Jesus Christ. So to my understanding, the prophet Jesus, or the Messiah Jesus, was an Israelite reformer, but he actually wasn't the son of God. He was an Israelite man. All right. So understand that, as I said, the sun god pagan idol worship was infused with the persona of an Israelite prophet, the Holy Trinity, and also the divine mother goddess attributes that were applied to Mary. So the whole concept of Mary having Jesus from a virgin birth, these are all old pagan ideologies that were applied via the Romans, teaming up with some of these Jewish rabbis behind closed doors to create this new quote unquote religion that's going to be called Roman Catholicism. All right. So the religion of Islam is a counter response to Rome's colonial expansion, because not all the Shemitic people during that time agreed with that, okay? So that's a little bit of, one of the reasons of why Islam showed up. It was the expansion of the Roman Empire, and it was also to clean up some of the dogma that was, infused by the Christian people, okay? Now, as far as who were these original people that created the Israelite religion, who were some of these people that originally created the Quran and what we call Islam, okay? Now, what I can tell you all is this. Was the prophet Muhammad a real man? I don't know. Was the prophet Ezekiel a real man? I don't know. Was the prophet Amos a real man? I don't know. But what I can tell you is this. There were real men that created the Israelite culture. There were real men that wrote the stories of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And those human men that were real, that inspired it and wrote it and created it and distributed amongst the world, those were men coming from a Shemitic ethnic background. So when we start talking about were these individual characters in the Bible real, I don't really concern myself with that too much. What I do know is that there were real men that made it, okay? So the original Shemitic Israelite Muslims and the original Shemitic Ishmaelite Muslims of Yemen, Jordan, Palestine / Canaan / Israel, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Egypt / Northwest Africa, and some of the Iberian Peninsula of Southern Europe were men and women who had an ethnic phenotype and physical appearance similar to the copper-colored indigenous American so-called black man. Both were labeled things such as, quote, Negro / Negroid, black, blackamoor, Afro-Asiatic, swarthy, tawny, red, Shemitic, Aboriginal, and ruddy, quote, for example. Different nations of people, but all having common ancestry going back to the original humans of Earth history. When you see the word, quote unquote, Negro used to describe the ethnicity of nations outside of the Americas, those are nations of people who have an ancient, quote, cousin link to the indigenous so-called Black American. So on the screen, what you have right here in front of you is an image of how the original Israelite and the original Ishmaelite men looked that were responsible for what we call the Israelite culture and later on the Islamic culture. All right. So what I'm saying is that the original Israelites were so-called black people. The people who were the original Muslims, the original Ishmaelites, they were so-called black people. OK, so the people who lived in Yemen, Jordan, Palestine, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, for thousands of years, these were a melanated so-called black people. Now, also remember this. Not all melanated people of the earth come from the same, we'll call ethnic background. All right. That's why you will see sometimes in literature, they'll use the word Afro-Asiatic and they'll use the word African. The Afro-Asiatic comes from a different ethnic background as the so-called African. Just like how in biblical history, they'll use the word Shemitic and the word Hamitic. So, for example, the Shemitic nations would have been like the Israelites or the Ishmaelites, and Hamitic nations would have been people like the Egyptians or the Canaanites. All right. So what we want to understand is that the so-called Black American, as far as our ethnicity, one of the words that's used for our people is so-called Negro. It's on a lot of our parents' birth certificates, our grandparents, etc. Right. And you also see that word used describing the mound builders, describing the original people of the Maya civilization and the original Olmec civilization. So what I'm saying right here is that although the indigenous American is its own person, we are our own people and our own nation, but we do have other ethnic groups around the world that we have like an ancestral cousin linked to. If you don't believe me, just think back on the Olympics that we were watching a couple of months ago when we had the World Olympics. You saw a lot of different nations playing in different sports, but there were melanated people in different nations that looked just like the so-called Black American. And you could tell the difference between, let's say, like, remember when Team USA, the basketball guys, when I think they played against Sudan, they were playing against some of the other brothers from Sudan. You could look at the Sudanese basketball players and you could tell that they come from a different ethnicity than the so-called Black American basketball players. You can tell. They both were dark skinned, both melanated people, but you could tell that they're not the same group because the so-called Black American, they would have labeled him as a Negro. And the Sudanese, they would have labeled them as Hamitic. Okay. So the point of this part of the video is to understand that the original so-called Black Muslims, they were coming from nations, that were in the Middle East or the Levant, and they were coming from nations in so-called Europe, but they had a physical ethnic appearance and phenotype just like the so-called Black Americans. So we looked similar. All right. That's what it was. And since ancient times, you had certain groups that came from other nations and countries to the Americas, and they were absorbed into the indigenous American populations as well. All right. During the 700s AD, that's another thing. So right here, you see, this is how one of the original Muslims look. That's how they look. Here go another picture right here. So this is how they looked. Okay. When they talk about the so-called Black Moors, this is how they look. All right. If these brothers today were to walk in the so-called Black community, they could blend right in. You wouldn't have not even known that they may have been really from Afghanistan or Iraq or Yemen or Saudi or Arabia, not Saudi Arabia, but Arabia. You would have not known that had they just kept their mouth shut. You know what I'm saying? And I know this to be true because a lot of brothers that I know that served in Afghanistan and served in Iraq, one of them I used to work out with, when he came back, he told me that he saw a lot of so-called Black men over there that looked just like us. They just spoke a different language. Okay. So that's how they looked. All right. Now keep all this in mind now, because we still answering, why does the European Christian nations of the Western world feel a little cautious about the so-called Black American man when he becomes Islamic? Okay. During the 700s Common Era or AD to about the mid to late 1800s, the leaders of the Islamic Caliphates were all so-called Black men, and they ruled over the European Caucasians and the amalgamated Turks, Arabs, Afghans, Iraqis, Iranians, Arabians, etc. They ruled the Levant or the Levantine. For example, the Osman Ali Caliphate would destroy Christian villages and enslave the people. Some of the melanated Muslims became very brutal and criminal and began to move away from the path of true Islam. They became slave raiders, capturers, human traffickers, engaged in prostitution, slavery. They started taxing people, creating jizya, and many other forms of oppression. They began to change the meaning of the Quran, Torah, and the gospel of Jesus to fit their own criminal ways. They became hypocritical. Just like Caiaphas and the other dirty Israelite priests, Jesus was calling out. Remember when the Messiah Jesus turned over their money tables and ran them out the temple. Remember the hypocrisy of the sons of Eli, who stole resources out of the temple and used their power to sleep with the women of Israel. The Alis, sheikhs, beys, emirs, and leaders of Islam became Luciferians and only seeking money and power. So what we're talking about right here is that you see this image right here where you got this melanated Muslim and how he's holding the head of a cut off Turk or a cut off Iraqi or a cut off Iranian or whomever this may be. Some of these melanated Muslims strayed off of the path of Islam and they got off of the deen, and some of them became corrupt and they started seeking money and power, and they would use the religion to, have xenophobic perspectives of other nations and other religions, even other melanated nations. So when you hear about the Islamic slave trade, this is what I'm talking about. Okay, this is what I'm talking about. So not all of the Black Muslims from the Middle East, Europe, Northwest Africa, not all of them were cool. Some of them were very, very criminal minded and evil. Okay, they were. All right. So when I talk about how, you had the European Christians, Caucasian Christians, a lot of the Christian women were taken and put in the harems against their will, and a lot of them were married off to some of these melanated men, and they would reproduce these amalgamated pale Arabs, these amalgamated pale Turks, these amalgamated pale Afghanis, these amalgamated pale Iraqis, these amalgamated pale Iranians, etc. This is how you get these amalgamated people throughout the so-called Middle East and certain parts of the Levant. All right. Even so-called Eastern Europe. OK. So let's move on a little bit. All right. In the early 1800s, during the Barbary Wars, in addition to many other wars, the European colonists of America and the aristocratic founding fathers were battling with a variety of Islamic powers. They were being extorted, taxed, ships seized, and bullied by Muslim corsairs and pirates throughout the Mediterranean and Americas. Some of the Islamic Muslims of Europe / the Middle East already had knowledge and networks in the Americas going back hundreds of years. Eventually, the American founding fathers got their independence, and the United States of America is established via the 13 colonies and expansion into the South, Midwest, and West. So what we're going to do right now is read about the Barbary Wars, because as you heard, I just described the Barbary Wars. So what was the Barbary Wars? The Barbary Wars were a series of conflicts between the United States and the Barbary states, a group of North African states that practiced piracy to extort tribute from weaker nations. The Barbary states, these states included Algeria, Tunis, Morocco, Tripoli. The Barbary pirates. These pirates were a diverse group of Turks, Arabs, and Berbers who targeted undefended ships and coastal settlements. They held non-Muslims for ransom. The first Barbary Wars. The United States fought 2 wars with the Barbary states. First Barbary War, fought from 1801 to 1805. This war was fought with Tripoli. The war ended with a peace settlement that stipulated that the United States no longer needed to pay tribute to Tripoli. Second Barbary Wars, fought from 1815 to 1816. This war was fought with Algiers. The war ended with an agreement that stated that the United States would no longer pay tribute and would enjoy full shipping rights. So when the United States of America was first established by the founding fathers, a lot of these Muslims during the Caliphate, in Europe, Northwest Africa, as it said, they were bullying them. They were taking the ships, they were seizing them, taxing them, holding the people hostage, things like that. And this was draining a lot of the resources and finances of the founding fathers when they were trying to start the United States in the late 1700s, early 1800s. A lot of these emirs, alis, beys, sheiks, that were taxing the Europeans, that were taxing the founding fathers, these were so-called black Muslims. All right. Once again, we're going into why does the United States of America have this caution when so-called black American men join Islam. All right. So you just got another reason, the Barbary Wars. OK. This is a background history to understand what is on record and file in the United States governmental archives. The United States government has seen Islamic extremism and horrorism at its highest levels. This is why there is a subconscious disdain for Islam by European Christians, dating back to the Holy Crusades of the 1000s AD, dating back to the wars for Jerusalem, the holy city. This is why there is a strong relationship between the current day United States government and Israeli government. It goes back to the days of Caiaphas, Pilate, Judas, and Jesus. This is the foundational distrust that exists between swarthy, Negro, black, ruddy, copper-colored men who practice Islam and certain factions within the United States Capitol Hill. Okay? So we just went into, some of this background history of the wars that European Christendom had with the Islamic Caliphate. All right. Going all the way back to the 1000s AD when they were fighting for Jerusalem in what they call the Holy Crusades, which happened in 3 different phases. OK, so there has been plenty of bloodshed and beef between European Christians of the West and the Islamic Empire. And when I say the European Christians of the West, I'm even talking about some of the black so-called Christians. OK, so you had Caucasian Christians who served as vassals and they were serfs, but they were ruled by the black or more European Christians who owned the land in Western Europe. OK, and when they wanted to get some of that land back in the Levant or the Middle East, they sent people to fight in there. They sent the Knights Templars and things of that nature. So you had so-called black Christians fighting against so-called black Muslims. All right. So that's just another history, just to think about. So the next thing we're going to talk about now is we're going to go a little deeper into, some case studies about the so-called Black American man and some of his extremism and horrorism as it pertains to Islam. Okay, just a few examples. All right. So the first thing you got to remember is this: the so-called Black American man has been subject to, a very, very oppressive system in this country for, we'll say, the last couple of 100 years, right? And this oppressive system has created a lot of trauma, okay? A lot of trauma. So when you think back to the early 20th century, a lot of our forefathers and foremothers, they were dealing with Jim Crow, racism, discrimination, and a lot of other horrific things, okay? And this creates a lot of, bitterness that the so-called Black American man has for not only Caucasian people, but for the United States government as well. So you can already get a little bit of an idea about why would the so-called Black American man, take an angle of being terroristic towards the so-called United States. And the reason why is because he's been oppressed very hard. No different than a lot of the people in the so-called Middle East today. So we don't want to be one-sided. We don't want to just look at, well, why does Al-Qaeda or why does the Taliban or why do some of these extremist groups perform the terrorist acts that they do? You got to look at some of the terrorism that's done to them. Think about how their lands have been colonized, conquered, how their natural resources have been extracted out the land, how their mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers have been killed from European colonialism, just like the so-called Black American has dealt with. Think about all the hangings our people have dealt with, us being ran off our land, the Trail of Tears and things of that nature. So it's not hard to understand why brothers, whether they in the Americas or whether they in the Middle East, would want to go against this. You know what I'm saying? It's not hard to figure out why. So I want you to think about the Nation of Islam, the 5% Nation, and the Moorish Science Temple in the early to mid 20th century. So we're talking about the late 1800s, early to mid 1900s, okay? A lot of the American brothers coming from the streets of the so-called Black community, these brothers were traumatized, all right? And this led them to the streets. A lot of Black men, when they go to the streets, it's for a variety of reasons. You know what I'm saying? Some of it is family. Some of it is just depression. Some of it is wanting to just express violence. It's a lot of reasons why brothers are led to the streets. But, you get led to the streets, you get involved in certain criminal activity or things you may not need to be involved in, and this will lead you to prison, okay? So what you had during the earlier 20th century, a lot of the brothers in prison were starting to convert to Islam. And they would find themselves in the Nation of Islam. They would find themselves in the 5% Nation. And they would find themselves in the Moorish Science Temple of America. And a lot of this was taking place in the northeastern states, New York, New Jersey, etc. A little bit of the Midwest as well, Chicago, Illinois, etc. So think about how the Nation of Islam, the Moorish Science Temple, a lot of these brothers in the 1920s, 30s, 40s that were, alongside Clarence Thomas X, that were alongside Elijah Muhammad, that were alongside Noble Drew Ali, a lot of these brothers was real gangsters. Like these was brothers that had committed real armed robberies, real aggravated assaults, real first degree murders. You know what I'm saying? Like these was real stomped down killers. Now they wanted to rehabilitate themselves, so they were trying to figure out how to do that. And that's what led them to Islam. But you still got to think about the background that they're coming from. Okay. Now, as it pertains to some of the terrorism on their own people, just think about how the so-called Nation of Islam, the death of Malcolm X, and think about how a lot of brothers turned gangster on him. So you have a certain gang element that was in the Nation of Islam. You had a certain gang element that was in the 5% Nation. You had a certain gang element that was in the Moorish Science Temple. Okay. So, did some of these Nation of Islam members possibly or potentially have something to do with the murder of Malcolm X? Weren't some of these guys Freemasons? Because as I told you all before, just like the Caiaphas, the priest who was a hypocrite, and just like some of these Islamic emirs and beys during the 14 and 1500s, how they were very evil. You always had evil men practicing Islam who were so-called Black. So that's no different than the so-called Nation of Islam, Moorish Science Temple, or 5% Nation. Some of them men were evil and criminal minded. Some of them were really just looking for protection and different financial opportunities. So understand that the United States federal government knows that a lot of men will convert to Islam, and some of it is sincere and some of it is not. But they know that all of them are coming from a traumatized background, and they tend to go to Islam to improve their lives. So the government knows this. You know what I'm saying? So just kind of think about that in the back of your mind. You know, the whole Malcolm X situation, how they were saying the so-called federal government was involved, and the New York police, Freemasonry. In other words, a lot of criminal element that really led to a man losing his life. And I'm not saying Malcolm X was perfect, you know, just like Blackbeard isn't perfect. You know, a part of me comes from a criminal background, just like Malcolm X. But, you know, the brother Malcolm probably was doing his best to clean himself up. But nevertheless, he still lost his life. OK. The next thing we're going to do is visit the Almighty Black P Stone Nation, and the El Rukns. All right. So what we're going to do next is talk a little bit about the El Rukn Libyan terrorist conspiracy. All right. And I'll give you a little brief background on it. OK. So first of all, the Almighty Black P Stone Nation is an American, quote unquote, street gang founded in Chicago. The gang was originally formed in the late 1950s as the Blackstone Rangers. The organization was founded by Eugene Harrison and Jeff Fort. In later years, under Fort's leadership, an Islamic faction of the gang emerged, naming themselves the, quote, El Rukn tribe of the Moorish Science Temple of America, or simply El Rukn. They eventually started describing themselves as Orthodox Sunni Muslims. Jeff Fort changed their Fort name from El Rukn Moorish Science Mosque to El Rukn Sunni Masjid El Malik. Okay. It's the main part I want to get to right here. Considered by law enforcement authorities to be Chicago's most powerful and sophisticated street gang, the Black P Stone Nation finances itself through a wide array of criminal activities and is part of a large Chicago gang alliance known as the People Nation. Under Fort's command, the Black P Stone Nation assumed an increasingly revolutionary outlook as it became associated with the, quote, Black nationalism movement, eventually attracting the attention of the Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan, who, quote, introduced them to Libyan leader Muammar al-Gaddafi and Nicaragua's. So first of all, let me stop right here. We don't know who introduced the El Rukns to the Libyans, okay? They saying Farrakhan right here, but you know, this is Wikipedia, so take that with a grain of salt, all right? Take that part with a grain of salt. This is the main part you need to get right here. In 1986, 4 of its members were indicted for conspiracy to commit terrorist acts in the United States for the Libyan government. The verdict marked the first time American citizens had been found guilty of planning terrorist acts for a foreign government in return for money. So we're going to get a picture of these brothers. So this is an image of some of the El Rukns out of Chicago right here. So basically what you had is that the Chicago Division's organized crime and drug enforcement task were tipped off by the ATF and the DEA about a Chicago gang doing drug trafficking. But while they were, doing surveillance on wiretaps, they started hearing about a potential international conspiracy involving the El Rukn street gang or criminal organization and Libyan terrorists. All right. So what ended up happening was a Chicago Joint Terrorism Task Force was created between, the DEA, the ATF, the FBI, and some of these other groups, the Chicago police, to do proper investigations. Because if the DEA is investigating for drug trafficking, because the El Rukns were involved in that, when they start hearing about Libyan terrorist plots, they had to get the FBI because this is out of their jurisdiction now. So now the FBI gets involved. And basically what the FBI found out was that you had representatives of the El Rukns starting to meet with hostile people that may have potentially been representing the government of Libya and possibly had connections to Muammar Gaddafi. Whether that's true or not and how detailed that is, even the FBI can't fully tell you, but they just know that they were catching this information on surveillance and eventually created a plot and a sting to catch the El Rukns red-handed, and they did, okay? So what ended up happening is that, after this narcotic investigation was taking place, Jeff Fort was in prison, and while he was in prison, he still was running the gang pretty much. And what they were doing they sent some people to meet with the Libyans, right? But remember, these so-called Black American men, the Libyans and these people in the Middle East, they take Islam serious. So a lot of brothers in the so-called Black community here, see, when we join things, we coming from a place of trauma and oppression. So we don't have any real ancestral cultural links that we remember about. So brothers are converting into Islam or, finding out that they are indigenous American, but you still really don't know what that means, And then you got the ones that join it for the wrong reasons, the ones that join it just for protection or the ones that join it for financial purposes. So you may have had certain brothers that were in the El Rukn, organization that were going to potentially make a lot of money by performing terrorist acts for some of these extremist Libyans. And they were going to perform terrorist acts here in the United States on domestic turf, all right? So the federal government basically created an operation where, they had a federal agent disguised, and he was going to sell the El Rukns basically a anti-tank missile, and some grenades and things of that nature. And they did a whole investigation. The El Rukns ended up meeting with the federal, agents at a hotel. They purchased the anti-tank RPG, and they were looking to get grenades and things of that nature. And then eventually the federal government caught them with it. And then, they were indicted, arrested, and they ended up basically going to prison. All right. So, the El Rukns, they potentially were going to try to do a terrorist act here on American soil. Once again, why would a so-called Black American man do that? Because during the 60s and 70s, our people were under harsh oppression. They were ordered for decades and decades before that. Now, as I said, do I agree that brothers, perform terrorism as a way to, retain our power here in America? I don't think terrorism is a way, but I understand why they were led to do that. I don't agree with it, but I understand why they did that. Okay. Now, something that's very interesting is this. I want you to think about the movie Back to the Future. So remember, the El Rukns, their situation happened in around 1986, right? The movie Back to the Future came out in 1985, okay? And the whole plot of the movie, let's read about what it is real quick. In the 1985 movie Back to the Future, Libyan terrorists are the main villains who seek revenge on Doc Brown for tricking them out of plutonium. It says the Libyan terrorists, also known as Libyan nationalists, were a group of terrorists that were trying to develop a nuclear weapon and asked for the assistance of Dr. Emmett Brown to build it. So in 1985, Hollywood put out a movie called Back to the Future, and the plot in the movie were Libyan terrorists who were plotting to do a terrorist attack. In 1986, the El Rukns get locked up and go to prison for a conspiracy of performing a terrorist attack on behalf of Libyans. What's the coincidence and what are the odds of that? 1985, Back to the Future comes out with a movie about Libyan terrorists. 1986, the El Rukns in Chicago commit a conspiracy with Libyans to do a terrorist attack. Some things just make you say, All right. The next thing we're going to talk about. So the next thing we're going to talk about is a brother by the name of Clement Rodney Hampton-El. And we're going to read about who he is. All right. Clarence Rodney Hampton-El, Rashid Hampton, Abdul Rashid Abdallah, or Dr. Rashid, was an American domestic terrorist. A member of the Moorish Science Temple of America, he was one of those convicted in the New York City landmark bomb plot. He testified that in 1988, he went to Afghanistan to help the Muslims there during Soviet-Afghan War. During trial in 1995, he admitted that he trained volunteer soldiers planning a mission to defend Bosnian Muslims against Serbian aggression. Project Bosnia. In 1992 and 1993, he made several trips to Europe and Asia, raising over $150,000 to start the Volunteer Muslim Militia Project. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison for his involvement in New York bomb plot. So the brother Clement Rodney Hampton-El was a so-called African American that was a member of the Moorish Science Temple. And he was also involved in the Farooq Mosque that was in Brooklyn. When they investigated the Farooq Mosque, this also included a lot of the men that later on were found out to be part of an Al-Qaeda terrorist cell. And these guys were planning terrorist attacks throughout, North America, basically. All right. So how many of you all knew that there was a so-called Black American man that was part of the Moorish Science Temple that was involved in Al-Qaeda, who was a mujahideen fighter or freedom fighter against the Soviet Union? He was a medic, and he was involved in terrorist plots that led to the 93 World Trade Center bombing, that also led to the 9/11 World Trade Center bombing. Okay? So this brother was a Brooklyn resident. He worked as a lab tech in Brooklyn before he converted to Islam. And he also was working as a combat medic for the Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan. And in 1993, he was arrested for his role in the New York landmark bomb plot. And he died in prison in 2014. And I'm going to show you a picture of the brother. That's a picture of how the brother looked, Clement Hampton-El, part of the Farooq Mosque in Brooklyn. He also was a member of the Moorish Science Temple. But basically, they found out about him when they were investigating this dude named the Blind Sheikh, who I believe was from Egypt. They were also investigating a man named Ali Muhammad, who was, long story short, like this triple agent that became a special forces operator in Fort Bragg. So he was basically a terrorist that somehow, some way got into the United States. He got through customs. He went to Fort Bragg. He went through special forces assessment. He became a special forces operator. Then he went back to the Middle East to train different fighters in the Middle East, taught them what he learned in special forces, American military, and then came back to New York and started helping the Farooq Mosque and started training certain terrorists here in the United States to do attacks here in the United States. All right. So this brother was hanging out with those type of people. So when they were investigating them, when they were like training with guns and AK-47s, things of that nature, when they were taking pictures, that's how they found out about this brother. And then they did further investigations, and then eventually he was taken down with that. So how many of you all knew that the so-called Moorish Science Temple had a connection, or a loose indirect connection? Let me rephrase that. It had a loose indirect connection, because not everybody that's part of the Moorish Science Temple is a terrorist. But you had a brother that was in the Moorish Science Temple that was connected to Al-Qaeda. What are so-called Black American men having to do with Al-Qaeda terrorist networks? How many of you all would have ever thought that a so-called Black American man was connected to 9/11 indirectly? All right. So this is what I mean by why the United States of America and certain factions within Capitol Hill are very cautious about the so-called Black American man, when he starts dealing with Islam. All right. Because it has a long history. It goes back to the gangsters of the Nation of Islam, the gangsters of the 5% Nation, the death of Malcolm X. It goes back to the El Rukns. It goes back to the terrorist conspiracies with the Libyans. It goes back to the Mujahideen. It goes back to the Farooq Mosque in Brooklyn. It goes back to the 93 World Trade Center bombing in the basement. All right. It goes back to the 9/11, the global war on terrorism. It goes back to the Barbary Wars. It goes back to the harems. It goes back to all this history, the Holy Crusades from 1000s AD. There's a long history, over 1,000-year history of so-called black men who are Muslims that if they choose to be extremists or if they choose to, act in form of terrorism, them boys be unleashing hell. So this is why, and we're gonna conclude it with this. This is why the modern day so-called black American rapper who's from the streets and he chooses to deal with Islam and he expresses it outwardly, this is why they have eyes on them. So whether it's Kevin Gates, whether it's Lil Durk, whether it's Rollo or whomever, they like when these brothers do certain criminal acts, it gets the government's attention. But when they see that it's Islam tied to it, the government starts wondering, are you all in contact with, extremists from ISIL? Are you all in contact with extremists from the Taliban? You see what I'm saying? Because by now, some of these terrorist networks are international. Now, we all know that some brothers from Vine City on the west side of Atlanta, they may not be connected to no Al-Qaeda network, but the government doesn't know that. So they'll have extra eyes on them. They'll send extra spies and extra snitches around them with wires on and things of that nature just to investigate and find out what they have going on. Remember, the federal government, the FBI, they found out that Rukns were engaging in a Libyan terrorist plot because they were drug trafficking. And this goes all the way back to the beginning of the video. If a true Muslim is one that submits their will to the Most High, Jeff Fort and them brothers, the Most High didn't want y'all selling drugs. You know what I'm saying? That's something that y'all chose to do to get money. And I'm not here to judge you on that. You know what I'm saying? Because I'm going to be judged for things that I've done on my great day. But when you stray off of the path, you opened up the door for criticism. So look at how that whole terrorist plot that El Rukns had going on, it was found out because y'all were drug trafficking. You see what I'm saying? And if you a real Muslim, you ain't dealing in no drugs. So we just went through a long, good history, and I hope that some people learn from it. Y'all hit us up in the comment section and let us know what you think. But this is the history of so-called black American criminal-minded Islamic extremists. And this is why if you're a brother and you walking down the street with a shamag on, or if you walking down the street and you got a full beard or any kind of outward appearance that makes somebody think that you either are an Israelite or a Muslim or anything that's other than anything other than what they're comfortable with, they're going to look at you a certain way. Like even when I'm in public, I may have on full military gear and I'll have on a shamag on my head, a red and white one or something like that. When I'm in the grocery store, most people mind their business, but every now and then you may get somebody look out the corner of their eye when they see a tall so-called black man, athletic, muscular built, looks militant, wearing what they call Islamic attire. They don't really know what I may be up on, even though I ain't on nothing violent. You know what I'm saying? But this is why. And this is why so-called black Americans, we have to get our nation and culture back together because, a lot of stuff just been looking funny lately, man. I'm going to just say that. A lot of stuff been looking funny, man. So hopefully you all got some enlightenment from this. Stay tuned. We out.